This is draft season, presented by Moody's, a proud partner of the New York Giants. Decode risk, unlock opportunity. Learn more at Moody's.com. John Schmeelk, Tony Pauline from Sportskeeda, back with you for another episode. Free agency is in the books, Tony, at least for the most part. You still have some guys that are out there. Some big-time quarterbacks are still out there, as Giant fans are well aware. We're still trying to figure some of that stuff out. But we have a much better feel. We always joke how mock drafts before free agency are pretty much useless. So I think it's a good time now to take a look at what these rosters look like as we're through that big first wave and even part of the second wave of free agency and kind of see where these teams are.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mason Graham to the Patriots, you can forget about that. The Dolphins filled needs at the safety position. You have to see where they go, and we'll go through it all. But absolutely, I mean, free agency for the longest time has been an area where teams can fill needs, which gives them options in the draft. Unfortunately, for other teams, it creates big holes that then have to be addressed in the draft.
Before we get to that, though, Tony, I feel like we should have one little pro day update. We haven't had a ton of pro days over the last couple of weeks, but we did have a fairly big one yesterday, I guess it was, right? Arizona had their pro day, which means we got to see Ted McMillan run. He only ran 140. Obviously, none of these times are official, but what did you hear from scouts about how he ran?
Well, it wasn't an Arizona Pro Day. From what I understand, is that McMillan just did a private workout for specific teams. It was reported at 4.48. You had said it's 4.55. I always figured he was going to be a 4.55 guy. I am kind of surprised that he even ran before the draft. But, that's the thing about McMillan. He's not a speed receiver. You're not drafting Ted McMillan for a vertical offense. You're drafting him to be a game-controlling, intermediate possession type receiver, and he's outstanding at that. I still think he's going to go top 10. I think the Patriots should give him serious consideration at number 4. I think the Jets should give him serious consideration at number 7. In my opinion, except if you're going to have Travis Hunter on your cornerback board, in my opinion, Ted McMillan is far and away the best receiver in this draft.
I agree. To me, I watched Golden since we've last talked, and I think he's going to be a really good player too. I like him, Tony, but I still have McMillan as my number one receiver. I would have in this draft class specifically. Last year, probably not. I wouldn't have him as a top 10 pick last year, but this year, top 10 pick all day for me. And I've heard Dallas at 12 would be interested in him if he gets there. So we'll see how that goes.
Dallas at 12 would jump all over him. I mean, I reported from the Senior Bowl that Dallas's goal is to come out of the first round with a receiver. And then later on, ESPN reported that Dallas would consider trading up for a receiver. And you've got to imagine it's going to be a guy like Ted McMillan.
Well, and that's exactly why we're doing this exercise today, Tony. We'll see what team needs are and where they might go. Just jumping out of me in general, looking through the teams, corner is a big time need for a lot of teams in this draft. Not a great draft to have a need at corner, but I do see that pop up often on my list. And then it's just always depth on the offensive and defensive lines. And I think this is a good draft to fill those needs specifically.
Yeah, I think a lot of teams address some of their needs, specifically on the interior of the offensive line. Like you said, I mean, with the cornerback, it's going to be slim pickings. And, the closer we get to the draft, the worse the cornerback class looks because of injuries, because of guys who really didn't live up to expectations in 2024. And that's why some of these quote unquote mediocre corners got really huge contracts over the last week in free agency.
Yeah, even a couple of these guys that I watched the last couple of weeks that worked out really well. Then I went back and I watched their tape and I'm like, that doesn't really look like that on tape. And I'm like, all right, I thought maybe he could be a third round pick. Maybe he's more of a fourth round pick. So, and then again, next week, by the way, folks, to give you an update, next week, me and Tony will do a mock draft. And then we'll probably do another position update, I would imagine, as Tony finishes tape and we get more pro days in the bag. We'll probably get close to the end of the pro day circuit at that point. So we'll try to do a little bit of a refresh on the positional rankings as we head into the NFL draft at the end of April. So let's start with the Tennessee Titans, Mr. Pauline. And it's funny, leaving the combine, I think both of us thought that the Titans would be very open to trading that first pick, and they still might very well be open to that. But boy, based on what they did in free agency, it just screams to me that they're going to take Cam Ward number 1.
And Cam Ward has always been in my mock drafts when I don't do trades, hypothetical trades. He's always been number 1 to the Tennessee Titans. And I reported from the combine that the Titans actually do like Cam Ward. I mean, they did a good job addressing needs on the offensive line, signing Dan Moore. A little bit of a risky signing there, but he's a good player, and the contract is structured that if he has a good year in 2025, he's going to make some big money moving forward. They bring in a veteran from Detroit like Kevin Zeitler. They did address some needs at the linebacker position with Draymond Jones and Cody Barton. So, are they going to take Abdul Carter with what they did in free agency? They still have maybe some needs at cornerback, although it's not that great. So you got to forget about Travis Hunter. What you said, it points to Cam Ward being selected with that pick.
Yeah, look, I honestly, in terms of their needs, Tony, I do still have edge, corner, and wide receiver as needs for them. So to me, that does leave the window open for an Abdul Carter, for a Travis Hunter. But if they like Cam Ward, they don't have a lot of guys in that quarterback room right now, other than Will Levis. So
they brought in what? They brought in Braden Allen to back, as a veteran backup.
Yeah, Brandon.
I mean, can you move forward? They got a new coach there. They got a new coach there. They got a new GM there. Are they going to move forward with Will Levis? I find that very difficult to believe, since Will Levis is not their player.
No, I agree with you 100%. All right, let's go to the Cleveland Browns at number 2, Tony. They obviously bring back Myles Garrett. They land Kenny Pickett in the trade. They also bring in Malik Collins, Cornelius Lucas, Joe Tryon Shoyinka, and then Devin Bush, the linebacker. So they bring in some players here, do the Browns. I take a look at their needs. To me, quarterback is still a screaming need, Tony. Kenny Pickett does not change that for me. I think other than Jerry Jeudy, they could use another wide receiver. And then at running back, Nick Chubb's not back yet. So, is Nick Chubb a guy that they want to supplement at running back? And then I think defensive tackle is a spot they could use some help at as well.
Yeah, I mean, bringing Myles Garrett back when he requested a trade was basically their free agency, and assigning him to that huge contract because he's such a good player. And, when you're a team like Cleveland that hasn't drafted well, in my opinion, it's just foolish to trade away your great players that you drafted in the hopes of getting more picks, and you don't know what you're going to get. But I agree with you. I mean, the quarterback situation is strange. Are you going to take a quarterback with the second pick of the draft when you brought Pickett in, you brought Pickett in via trade? You still got Deshaun Watson there, although he's changed his contract around. Eventually, he's going to be back. May not be in 2025, but he's going to be back in one shape or another. Offensive line is also a need. Jedrick Willis, you don't know what you're getting from him. Was injured last year. They could bring Nick Chubb back. It's interesting. They have a lot of needs on offense. But when they are called to the clock, if we assume Cam Ward's the first pick of the draft, the best players on the board are going to be on defense. Abdul Carter and Travis Hunter, if you look at him as a cornerback.
I'm with you. The first 3 needs I have for Cleveland are all on the offensive side of the ball, Tony. So I'll be interested to see what they do there. Let's go to the Giants at 3, and this is why I think we think quarterbacks will go early in this draft, Tony, even if the grade might not be there. The third straight team at the top of the draft where I list quarterback as the number 1 need. All they have right now in the quarterback room is Tommy DeVito. Now, this is recording on Tuesday, airing on Wednesday. Maybe they'll have another quarterback in the room by then, but they need a quarterback. I still think they could use some youth at defensive tackle, interior offensive line, offensive tackle, and then maybe some wide receiver as well. So, again, I think the Giants will be looking for a quarterback here. If that doesn't work out, they could use some depth at the edge position on defense. Azeez Ojulari just signed for the Philadelphia Eagles, who's behind Brian Burns and Kayvon Thibodeau. So I could see them easily being an Abdul Carter team if he gets to them at number 3 and the quarterback is not there.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a bizarre situation. There's no other way to say it. I mean, here we are midway through March, and the Giants don't have a starting quarterback. And even if there's a starting quarterback there, they can't make a trade to get up and get Cam Ward. Do you take Shedeur Sanders? It's a strange situation. Obviously, we have to see what happens the way it plays out. If they're able to get Aaron Rodgers, what do they do then? Is there any market for that pick? Because the Giants do have a lot of needs.
Hey, look, without a starting quarterback in the building, you don't know what it's going to look like. So I think until the starting quarterback is there, there's very little clarity on what next season is going to look like. And, whether it's an Aaron Rodgers or a Russell Wilson, I think they'll bring in a veteran, Tony, and then I think they will add a quarterback in the draft. Whether it's a 3, I have no idea. But I think at some point they will add a quarterback at some point to supplement whomever that veteran is. All right, let's go to the Patriots at 4. I hesitate to list all the guys they signed, Tony, because there were
Yeah.
many. They had a ton of money to spend, and they spent a lot of it, but they still have a lot left, to be quite honest with you. Milton Williams and Carlton Davis and Harold Landry and Robert Spillane were the big additions on defense. Good players. They're all going to start. Mike Vrabel trying to build up that defense. And then on offense, Morgan Moses, the offensive tackle, the veteran, Matt Collins, the wide receiver, were the main additions on that side of the ball. But look, you look at the Patriots, they still have need on the offensive line,
Yep.
specifically at left tackle. They have needed wide receiver on offense with their, Javon Baker and Jalen Polk not really working out last year, at least yet. So I think offensive line, wide receiver, and then edge. Those are the spots I'd be looking at if I were the Patriots.
Yeah, I think they basically answered all their needs on defense in
Yeah.
free agency in the first week, which basically points to it being an offensive draft, at least in the early portion. Offensive line, we'll talk about that next week when we do our mock draft. Receiver, the thing about the Patriots with the receiver position is they're never able to develop a receiver one that they drafted. You just mentioned guys they drafted last year. You can go you go earlier than that. When Belichick was there, they have just not been able to really develop receivers, especially the ones that they select early in the draft. Maybe it's different this year with Mike Vrabel. Vrabel does, relish. He does put an importance on the big receivers. That's why he had the issue with A.J. Brown where he wanted to resign him, which led to his exit at Tennessee. So I think early on, you're looking at offense because I think the Patriots did such a good job addressing defensive needs in free agency.
Is there an offensive tackle, Tony, that could be worth the bang for the buck there at 4?
Well, I mean, we'll see. I mean, Will Campbell at the top of his game is an outstanding pass protector, but he's got the short arms. And as we've talked about on this podcast, he's very soft at times. Armand Membo, he's flying up draft boards. He's gonna land in the top 10. The question is, do you think you can play him at left tackle? And if you can't, are you happy or are you comfortable taking him and moving him inside to guard? Armand Membo has been on a straight shot north literally since the start of the 2024 season. His combine workout was outstanding, as I wrote at Sportskeeda. The guy looked like a 330-pound sprinter when he was doing those pulling drills, when there were the long pulls to the left and the right. I mean, the way he moved and with the speed that he moved, there's nothing but upside with that guy.
Absolutely. All right, let's go to the Jacksonville Jaguars at number 5 here, Tony. They do a lot of work in free agency as well. On offense, they had Patrick McCarry and Robert Hainsey to be starting offensive linemen for them at guard and center. On defense, Jordan Lewis and Eric Murray to play in the secondary. De'Ami Brown, in addition, a wide receiver. So they do add some folks to the Jaguars, Tony. I look at their needs. A cornerback, to me, still screams as a need, especially an outside corner. I know they've added a lot of guys on the offensive line. I look at that group, especially offensive tackle, Tony. I don't feel great about it. And then I know they drafted Brian Thomas Jr. last year, but they let Christian Kirk go. I think they could use a weapon or two for Trevor Lawrence as well.
Defensive tackle as well. I mean, they've been hurting for a defensive tackle for a number of years now. But the problem is, you look at the Jacksonville Jaguars draft history the past 5 to 6 years, they've expended so much early draft capital on defensive front 7 players. I think, and you mentioned they let Christian Kirk go. They also let Evan Ingram go, and now they have a hole at tight end. I don't understand that move. I know he was injured last year, but you've got a quarterback there, and Trevor Lawrence. You want to add weapons. You don't want to get rid of weapons. So that was kind of a strange move to me. I would agree with cornerback. I also think defensive tackle, Mason Graham. More than anything else, he's one of the safer picks at the top of the draft. You know what you're getting with him. May not have the same upside as many of the other players, but you know what you're getting with them. And really, with a lot of those defensive front 7 players that Jacksonville has drafted the past couple of years, they've not been safe picks. They've been up and down. They've been inconsistent, or they've been outright busts.
Yeah, and on defensive tackle, Tony, you're right. Eric Armstead is 31. Mason Smith was a pick last year. Davon Hamilton, a 3rd-round pick in 2020. So Jordan Jefferson, a 4th-round pick last year. So I am with you. They do have some need at defensive tackle for sure. Raiders at number 6. They don't need a quarterback anymore with Geno Smith there, Tony, but I think they could use someone to throw the ball to a little bit. They don't have a ton of weapons out there. Brock Bowers is obviously very good. And the wide receiver they got from the Patriots 2 years ago, Jacoby Myers is a good player. But I think they could use another weapon outside. They could use some help on the offensive line. Then I think on cornerback, on defense, is a spot that certainly needs some bolstering.
Need a lot of help on the offensive line. Need some help at cornerback. I still think, despite the fact, the contract they gave to Max Crosby, they could still use another edge rusher. I think they're going to address the quarterback position at some point in the draft to bring in a younger guy that, can learn under Geno Smith. I don't know that quarterback is Aiden O'Connell. Whether they do it, this early in the draft or they do it in day two remains to be seen.
I think a running back, too, is something that they could add, Tony. I don't love that running back spot there right now. I think that's another spot you could take a look at for the Raiders. All right, Jets at 7. I think they need some help at wide receiver and tight end, Tony. They just need weapons to go with Garrett Wilson. They could still continue to bolster that offensive line, in my opinion. You can never stop that. And they did lose a corner in free agency. I think they could use some help outside as well in defense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're bringing Justin Fields in. You got Garrett Wilson there already, and he will hopefully be there for a while. Alan Lazard is likely on his way out. Xavier Gipson, he's a nice number 5 receiver. He's not a starting receiver. He's a return specialist. Desperate need for receivers there. There's a desperate need at the tight end position. I am, in my own self, very disappointed that Ruckert has not turned out to be the tight end that we all thought he could be when he was drafted. And even though they gave big money to Brandon Stevens, I agree with you. A number 1 cornerback or another cornerback is needed. I should say number 1. Sauce Gardner's there, but another big time cornerback is there. They'll have their options, and they could probably be lucky because you could have the best receiver on the draft available to them. You could have the best cornerback in the draft available to them. And, would they take Tyler Warren with that 7th pick? Oh, my gosh. I don't know. Last time they took a tight end early in the draft from Penn State, we saw what happened.
That would be Kyle Brady for the fans that are too young to remember that. Back in, what year was that, Tony?
95, I believe. 95?
Was it 95? Yeah, it might have been that far, that long ago. Wow. Whew. All right, Carolina Panthers at number 8, Tony. They did some work in free agency. They brought back some of their own guys. Tommy Tremble back, J.C. Horn on the big extension, Michael Jackson, the cornerback, also back. They add a couple defensive players, too. Look, their defense was a mess last year. So they do a lot of work on that side. Trayvon Morg, the safety on a big contract. Tershawn Wharton coming over from the Chiefs, a big contract. And then Patrick Jones coming over as well. So they try to really improve their defense here, Tony. When I look at their needs, I got wide receiver still. I know they have Adam Thielen. I know they drafted the kid out of South Carolina last year. But I think wide receiver is a spot they need help at. And then I still think they need some help at corner.
And tight end as well. I mean, Tommy Tremble's their starting tight end. So they did a good job on the defensive line of free agency. Adding Morrig, I think, was another piece at the cornerback position.
Safety
position. I'm sorry, safety position. Are they happy with what they have at edge rusher? And some more offensive linemen because Bryce Young seemingly has turned it around. And I don't say he's not living up to expectations, but he's not the biggest bust, as everyone was saying just 9 months ago. But I agree with you. Receiver, tight end, maybe some offensive linemen, and then some players in the defensive back 7.
I'm with you. All right, let's jump over to the New Orleans Saints here, Tony. They're always aggressive. Like they don't hesitate throwing money around and kicking the can down the road. They bring back Chase Young. They bring back Juwan Johnson. They bring back Isaac Yiadom. And then they sign Justin Reed, the safety, and then they have a couple minor guys coming in as well. And when I take a look at the Saints team, look, they still need an edge rusher. I feel like they've been searching for an edge rusher for a while, Tony, a pass rusher off the edge. I think now they're at the point where they might be able to use some wide receiver help next to Chris Olave. And at some point, do they have to have the succession plan to Alvin Kamara? I don't know how much longer he's going to keep going at running back.
I think this is what happens, and they still need offensive line help. And I think this is what happens. We talked about Jacksonville and so much early draft capital being spent on defensive line and pass rushers, and it hasn't worked out. I mean, how much early draft capital have the New Orleans Saints spent on the offensive line?
Trevor Penning, Cesar Ruiz, Eric McCoy, Taliesin Fuaga. It's just a
Right.
lot of guys.
And they still need help there. And this is another team. We talked about the Patriots. We've talked about the Jets, even the Panthers. Another team that needs wide receiver and tight end. Wide receiver and tight end. I do think that they could use an outside linebacker, but I know that they were very high on Brock Bowers last year. Lost out on him. Wide receiver and tight end. And again, that's not going to fill their needs. Is Derek Carr there for the mainstay? You mentioned running back. Fortunately for them, they'll be able to address the running back position sometime in day 2, even day 3, because it's such a deep class.
All right, the Chicago Bears have been busy, Tony. They select
Yeah.
with pick number 10. They do a good job of really solidifying the interior offensive line. They trade for Jonah Jackson, they trade for Joe Tooney, and they sign the top center on the market in Drew Dahlman. So I think they feel probably pretty good about their offensive line situation right now, do the Bears. But I think they could use another offensive tackle. So, do they try to kind of complete that group with an offensive tackle? Do they go after an edge player on defense, or I still think they could use some help on the outside pass rush? And then, look, we saw when Ben Johnson was in Detroit, they picked Jahmyr Gibbs early. It would
Yeah.
not shock me if we see an early draft running back go to the Bears either.
I mean, first of all, the Bears, in my opinion, have had the best offseason in football. Bringing in Ben Johnson, which was everybody wanted Ben Johnson as head coach. They basically transformed the interior of that offensive line. Obviously, it looks like they're happy with Braxton Jones. Maybe they pull a surprise in the draft. But everything right now points to Ashton Genty. There is some thought process out there. It could be a tight end like Tyler Warren. But again, as I reported, Sportskeeda from the Combine, Ben Johnson, the whole object is to build around Caleb Johnson and build Caleb Williams and build an offense that is going to play to his strengths. I think thus far they've done a fantastic job of it.
Completely agree. And they're going to want to run the football there. So, again, a running back would not shock me at all. The San Francisco 49ers lost a bunch of guys here, Tony. I will not go through the whole list. They had some minor signings: Luke Farrell, the tight end; Mac Jones, backup quarterback; Demarcus Robinson, the wide receiver. Nothing crazy there. They bring back Kyle Juszczyk after letting him go. Jordan Mason ends up getting traded, so he's not a running back anymore. But look, the Niners are starting to have some holes, Tony.
Yep.
They traded Deebo Samuel in the offseason as well. I still don't love their offensive tackle situation. I think you eventually have to figure out your succession plan after Trent Williams. He's getting older. I think they can use some help on the defensive line. So I think this is a trenches draft for the Niners, Tony. I think they need to reinvest in that part of their team. Offensive line, defensive line.
Yeah, and this is, when they say you got a short window or you better win when that window is there for you, and it looks like that window, if it's not closed for the 49ers, is quickly closing. I would agree with you. They need an edge rusher. They need offensive linemen, interior offensive linemen. You mentioned tackled. I mean, do you take one of these guys, plug him in on the Kelvin Banks or Will Campbell, whoever, use him at guard, and then basically groom him to play offensive tackle in the future? I mean, that's a possibility. You can kind of kill two birds with one stone, but I think they've got to look early on anyway at the edge rusher and interior offensive line.
All right, let's go to the Dallas Cowboys. They select next. A couple trades for them, a couple of former first-round picks, Kyer Elam and Kenneth Murray, coming on board for some late-round pick swaps. They bring back Osa Digizua, Marquise Bell, a couple other guys on defense, special teamers. They bring in a bunch of guys that I think have some pedigree, Tony, and will provide some depth for them, but nobody that's a high-end player, certainly. Rob Jones, who's an offensive lineman who's had a lot of injury issues. He's a guard. Solomon Thomas, the defensive tackle, who's been a solid pro, but he's underwhelmed based on what his draft position was. Javonte Williams, who I don't still think has bounced back from that knee injury. Peyton Turner, a former, you mentioned the Saints investing in draft picks, and they haven't worked out. He's one of them. Jack Sanborn, good linebacker. Miles Sanders, Dante Fowler, Paris Campbell. So the Cowboys, a bunch of guys on like one-year contracts here, Tony. But look, who are the receivers other than CeeDee Lamb? They traded for the young Panthers wide receiver last year, whose name is escaping me at the moment. He was a second-round pick for them a couple years ago. Kavonte Turpin, Jalen Tolbert. It's just not exciting at wide receiver. I still think they could keep getting younger and solidifying the offensive line. Javonte Williams is their only running back. Rico Dowdle left. They could use a running back on that team. And then I still think defensive tackle and linebacker, inside linebacker are spots that they could use help in well. So a lot of needs for the Cowboys.
Jonathan Mingo is the name that
Thank you.
Skip had traded for the Dallas traded for, and I agree. I mean, again, go back to Senior Bowl. I reported they're looking at receiver. They want to fortify that defensive front seven. Re-signing Digizua is a good start. They absolutely can use a running back, but I think the signing of guys like Javonte Williams means that they probably will look to get another back later in the draft, given the depth of the position. The question is, do they think Ted McMillan's going to fall to him? I don't think he's going to. Do they trade up for Ted McMillan? Is Luther Burden, in the mix for them? Is Emeka Ibuka? It's a little bit
Matthew
early, but I'm
Golden.
told
Yeah.
he's going to run very, very fast. Dallas they're in a kind of a strange situation unless, as they say, manna from heaven falls to them and Ted McMillan drops to their selection.
All right, let's go to the Miami Dolphins, Tony. I know their fans have been freaking out a little bit because they were very quiet in free agency. Nick Westbrook-Akine, the wide receiver, minor contract. And then James Daniels was their only really big addition on the defensive line. So they haven't really done a ton to help themselves because, they spent a lot of money on Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Tua Tagovailoa. So not a ton of money there. Even they, on defense, Chubb on the defensive line. Look, to me, Tony, their interior offensive line is they've solidified it, but I think they need defensive tackles. They lost Christian Wilkins last offseason, cornerback, safety.
Yeah.
I think the Dolphins really need to invest in their defense here, I still think have a lot of holes in my opinion.
And then maybe even a wide receiver. I would agree with you. I think right now it's looking like a defensive tackle. Some people think if Will Johnson is there, that could be the pick. They signed 2 safeties, but I mean, the guys that they signed were basically situational players or backups from the teams they came for. You can't expect Ashton Davis to be your starting safety. So, if the kid, Warrior is there from South Carolina, they have holes, but, they should be able to fill that hole with the 13th pick of the draft with a good player.
I'm with you. Let's go to the Indianapolis Colts, Tony. Cameron Bynum, they were very active. I think it's pretty obviously that Chris Ballard's trying to make a run here to try to get better. They bring in Daniel Jones to compete with Anthony Richardson, couple defensive backs, and Cameron Bynum, the safety from Minnesota, Charvarius Ward coming over from the 49ers. Khalil Herbert is a backup running back to Jonathan Taylor. But look, you look at their team, Tony, I still think they could use a tight end.
Yes.
I think they could use a cornerback. I think they could use a guard, and I think they can use some outside and inside linebacker help on defense.
Yeah, there's a screaming need of tight end. And I mean, whether it's Anthony Richardson, whether it's Daniel Jones, you got to give him a target to play with. I still think they could go safety if a top safety is there or, somebody in the defensive backfield. But tight end is the number one need. The question is, does Tyler Warren fall to them at 14? Or would they take Colston Loveland at that selection? I don't think so because of the injury.
Yeah, we've listed tight end and wide receiver for a bunch of teams here, Tony. We'll see how high those guys end up going in a very deep draft on the defensive front. All right, let's go to the Atlanta Falcons. They bring back a lot of their own players. They signed Divine Diablo, the linebacker, safety combo guy. Leonard Floyd continues his tour of the National Football League on one-year contracts at edge. Mike Ford, a small contract to play corner for them. And look, I'm still looking, aside from center, Tony, where I'm not sure what they're going to do. Look, I think the Falcons have got to get this defense better, and I think that's got to be their top priority. Defensive tackle, edge players, corner.
Yep. Yep.
Figure out a way to stop the pass because that's something they were not able to do last year.
I think the Falcons' needs, which you illustrated, and including center and safety, basically the same now as they were before free agency started. I don't see that they've helped themselves at free agency. Obviously, they lost the center, so that's a position that they're going to have to fill. Unlike the Bears, I don't think they're any better of a team after free agency than they were before it started.
All right, let's go to the Arizona Cardinals. They have the 16th overall pick here, Tony. And look, they're on a rebuild, so they have a lot of work to do still. They were not super active in free agency, but they did do some damage. Their big signing was Josh Sweat on the edge. Big contract. Dalvin Tomlinson, who's been a solid defensive tackle for a long time. Those are their major additions here. They bring back Baron Browning as an edge player. But I think, frankly, Arizona and the Falcons have very similar needs, Tony. Edge players, defensive line players, cornerback. And then I'll throw in wide receiver and offensive line for the Cardinals as well. They still have a lot of work to do.
I'm going to go with those last two as their primary needs. I think they did a good job, signing Sweat. I think Tomlinson is underrated. He's a veteran. People will gravitate, players will gravitate because of the way he plays. I think I like what they did on defense, which means I think it's going to be more offensive oriented. Would it be a receiver? Would it be, offensive line? They've drafted a lot of offensive linemen. Paris Johnson finally back at the right position at left tackle. You got to protect Kyler Murray if you want him to be effective. So I think that's the way it's looking based on what they did in free agency.
All right, Cincinnati Bengals at 17, Tony. I think they're going to have to eventually add some non-wide receivers to the roster. They did bring back a lot of players on free agent contracts. I mentioned Chase and Higgins with their monster deals. B.J. Hill back, a good solid defensive tackle. Mike Gesicki back at tight end. Joseph Osai back as an edge player. The only guys from the outside they brought in were Tedarrell Slayton, the defensive tackle, and Samaje Perine, who returns to be their backup running back. So you look at this Bengals team, Tony, and pass rushers, cornerbacks, defensive tackles, and maybe a guard.
Or maybe an offensive lineman. Another offensive lineman. They drafted Amarius Mims a few years ago. We see what happens with Trey Hendrickson as far as the edge is concerned.
Yep.
When it's a defensive tackle, I think they want a bigger guy. They want a big body space eater in the middle of the line to complement the other players there.
Oh, sounds like a Kenneth Grant team, Tony.
Potentially, unless the Miami Dolphins take Kenneth Grant. But that's the way it looks. Still have to see what happens with Trey Hendrickson. He wants to stay, but he wants to get paid. Another team pays him. Trey Hendrickson could be on his way out of town.
Seattle Seahawks throwing some money around, Tony. They select 18th. Obviously, they switch out Geno Smith. They get an extra pick for Sam Darnold. I think it makes sense based on where they are. They get a pick in the DK Metcalf trade. They bring back Ernest Jones and Jaron Reed. They also bring in Cooper Kupp, DeMarcus Lawrence, Marquez Valdez-Scantling. You look at the Seattle team, I think their defense looks pretty strong right now, Tony. I think Mike McDonald's done a good job of bringing in the guys they need on defense. They could always use another edge player. They don't have a dominant pass rusher yet. But look, I still think they need help on the interior offensive line, maybe right tackle as well, depending on how healthy their right tackle is going to be. And then wide receiver and tight end are two spots where I think they could use some help.
Yeah, especially receiver. I mean, they've created holes, cutting players and trading players at the receiver position. So I think that's an area. It'd be ironic if Emeka Buka ends up playing with his former teammate Jackson Smith-Njigba if Seattle decides to go in that direction.
Yeah, I agree with you. All right, let's go to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers next, Tony. They select at 19 overall. They bring back Chris Godwin, Ben Bredeson, Levante David. Those are the major ones. They bring in Hassan Reddick as I think he might have been the first free agent signed, if I remember properly. And Anthony Nelson comes over as well to the Tampa Bay Bucks. You look at, for me, Tony, I think they could still use another edge player. Levante David at some point is going to stop being able to play football. I think they might need an inside linebacker at some point. And I don't know how much you love Cade Otton. I think they could use another tight end. And I think on defense, they could use a safety.
Yeah, I think linebacker. I like the Hassan Reddick trade. I think, they're a team, Tampa, that has used a lot of draft picks on edge rushers. It hasn't worked out. I think the Hassan Reddick signing was a good one. Obviously, he's got a chip on his shoulder considering what happened last year with the Jets. Is this a place where Jihad Campbell goes? I mean, they do need a linebacker, an off-ball linebacker. He's the best off-ball linebacker here. I think a cornerback is also a consideration, and offensive line, as you mentioned.
All right, let's go to the Denver Broncos at pick number 20. We're doing a good job rolling through these pretty quick, Tony. I'm very impressed. Excellent work.
Here we go.
All right. They bring back DJ Jones. They don't trade. I guess that was a signing, right? Evan Ingram. Jarrett Stidham comes back as their backup quarterback. They let Zach Wilson go. Then they sign a couple of, I would say, high-risk players, right? Just because of the injury history. Talanoa Hufanga at safety on a big contract. Dre Greenlaw, he's a year off his injury. He should be okay. And Matt Peart comes back as a swing tackle for them. Tony, the Broncos have a nice little roster, man. I was very impressed when I was looking at them. But running back is a screaming need for me for them. If he gets there, that's an Ashton Genty, I think, landing spot. That's an Omarion Hampton landing spot. Their center, I think, maybe a little bit more help. And then on defense, I think edge is a big need for them still. And then Outside of Patrick Surtain, I think they could use another corner.
And maybe even another safety,
Yep.
depending on what happens. But I agree with you. I mean, it's running back. I think signing Evan Engram after or basically picking him up off the waiver wire was a tremendous move. Maybe they get a tight end later in case Evan Engram can't make it through the entire season. But I think they've done a good job in the offseason to fill needs. Right now, I'm looking at them as running back, maybe another safety, maybe another tight end.
All right, now we get to the Pittsburgh Steelers, Tony, and Mike Tomlin's the double-edged sword. He's great. He always figures out how to win games. He's a great coach. Here's the problem. The Steelers are never in a position to draft a quarterback. That's how they wound up with Kenny Pickett a couple years ago. And now, again, they're sitting at pick number 21 here with Mason Rudolph as the only viable quarterback on their roster. In free agency, they brought in Darius Slay, Mason Rudolph, Malik Harrison, Kenneth Gainwell's a backup running back, not a ton of work. They obviously trade for DK Metcalf, which was the big one, and then the huge extension for him. But it starts with quarterback for the Steelers, Tony. They let Najee Harris go. I think they can maybe use a running back to pair with Jalen Warren. You have to, at some point, assume Cameron Hayward. I put him in the Levante David category. They're really good players, but how much longer can he keep playing at a high level? So I think defensive tackle is another spot. And then even with the addition of Darius Slay, I could see them adding a young corner as well.
Well, don't forget, they also signed Brandon Eccles as their nickelback, which I thought was an excellent signing
Oh,
because
that's a good one. You're right.
Eccles, was effective when he was on the field for the Jets. I would agree. Defensive line or running back. Those are going to be the two big needs early on. I don't know that there's going to be a good running back there at 21. Would they reach for a guy like Omarion Hampton that early? But I do think of Walter Nolan, Tyleek Williams, someone like that will be available to them.
All right, let's go to the AFC West and say what's up to the Los Angeles Chargers, who were quiet in free agency, Tony. They did not do a ton in terms of adding people to that team. Mekhi Becton, gigantic guard that screams Jim Harbaugh. Dante Jackson, the corner. Mike Williams comes back. Najee Harris, I mentioned them. Benjamin St. Juste comes over. They ended up re-signing some of their guys. Elijah Molden back. Khalil Mack back on a pretty big one-year contract. Tyler Tart back. Jalen Reagor back. Bradley Bozeman back. So some quiet moves or smaller moves by the Chargers trying to kind of keep that team intact. When I went through their roster, Tony, I think defensive line is going to be a huge need for them. It's a good draft to have those needs, defensive tackle and defensive end. And then, look, they need another receiver. Like, Ladd McConkey can't do it all himself, dude. Like, they need someone out there that can make some plays at wide receiver and give Justin Herbert some targets.
They also need a tight end. I mean, Will Dissly's their number one tight end. So I think that the Mekhi Becton signing was terrific. It filled a need. He showed the ability to play last year with good coaching. We know how much Harbaugh, values offensive linemen. Like you said, it was a Jim Harbaugh signing. I think Najee Harris was also another good signing. I think I would agree with you about the defensive tackle position, but I also think a receiver or a tight end is there.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I would also consider, maybe another running back to pair with Najee Harris as a change of pace guy, too. I think it'd be something that I would consider. The Packers, Tony, they bring in Aaron Banks to play guard for them on a monster contract. They bring in Nate Hobbs to play cornerback for them, and they re-sign linebacker Isaiah McDuffie. So I was really impressed when I looked at the Packers roster, Tony. It's good. They have a good roster. I think they're missing like star level players. So I know they don't do this generally, but I would consider a trade up to try to get a difference maker. But if they sit and pick at 23, a corner, I don't think, there's rumors that they might move on and trade their veteran quarterback, Jair Alexander. Defensive tackle, I think Kenny Clark's getting a little bit older. If you want to try to build that up a little bit. They're pretty deep at edge with Van Ness and, Gary. But I guess you could always add some help there. And then I think they have a deep wide receiver room, Tony, but do they have a difference-making wide receiver in that room? So I can see them maybe trying to add a big-time player there if they can.
I'd say defensive line, wide receiver, and cornerback. The only thing is, you're going to get the same type of receiver at 23 that's already on the roster. I don't know that you're going to get a big-time player there. The problem is they're in potentially the best conference in the NFL. Especially with Chicago now, you expect Chicago to make a jump. So as talented as they are, that is a tough conference. Defensive line, wide receiver, cornerback.
Totally agree. All right, let's go to the next team on this list. 24th overall, the Minnesota Vikings, Tony. They lost some guys in free agency, but they were also the Cameron Bryan being the most notable one that they let walk out the door. But boy, the Vikings were not hesitant about throwing money around. Will Fries, the offensive guard, to help solidify the interior of that offensive line. Jonathan Allen and Javon Hargrave to try to solidify the middle of that defensive line. Ryan Kelly will be their starting center this year. I think they want to run the ball a lot better. They bring back Byron Murphy on a big deal. They bring back Aaron Jones. They bring back Theo Jackson and Harrison Smith to play safety. Nice little roster there. To me, it's still edge and corner, Tony, that they
Yeah.
could use a little bit of help. And I know people will roll their eyes at me probably because they have Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. Who are their next receivers after those two guys? It gets dicey quick. I could see them being a mid-late round wide receiver team too.
They did sign Isaiah Rodgers and Jeff Okudah at the cornerback spot. So I think if a good cornerback is there, but what cornerback is going to be there? Are you taking Shannon Ravel? Are you taking Benjamin Morrison?
Trey
What cornerback?
Amos.
You
Yeah.
know, I do think safety is a position. Maybe this is where Malachi Starks goes. If a team prior, if Denver doesn't take Malachi Starks, I think that safety is a position that they're definitely going to look at.
Houston Texans at 25, Tony. Obviously, they have CJ Stroud at quarterback. Weird moves this year. They really changed out a lot of their offensive line, which was a weakness for them. They do bring in Christian Kirk, CJ Gardner Johnson, and Ed Ingram on trades to try to solidify the offensive line. I don't know how much better it is. Derek Stingley Jr. on a big re-sign, 3 years, $90 million. Mario Edwards comes back on the defensive line. Those are the major moves there. I take a look at this Houston Texan team, Tony. I'm looking at offensive line, and then maybe a wide receiver too, because we don't know what Tank Dell's future is going to be there.
Maybe a defensive tackle. I know they brought in Sheldon Rankins, so you're relying on him. But yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens with them with their offensive line. I mean, is Blake Fisher their left tackle of the future, or are they, are they comfortable with that? Especially with a guy like C.J. Stroud. I mean, this is an organization that seems to be moving north and just needs a few more pieces, and then they trade Tunzel. I would agree with you also about the receiver position as far as depth is concerned.
I'm with you on that. All right, let's go to the next team. The Los Angeles Rams, who obviously their biggest move this offseason was keeping Matthew Stafford, their starting quarterback, which is obviously a very big keep for them. Jimmy Garoppolo comes back as their backup. But then in free agency, Devontae Adams, Tony, a 2-year contract. He can still play to go with Puka Nacua and wide receiver, two very big-bodied wide receivers. They re-signed Tutu Atwell at wide receiver as well. And then Poona Ford comes in on the defensive line. I took a look at their roster. Cornerback, I know they don't really value the position, but I think inside linebacker is a spot where they need a lot of help. Tight end, Tyler Higbee. I don't know how much he's got left in the tank. And then I would keep trying to solidify that offensive tackle spot if I were them, Tony.
Yeah, I've got cornerback, tight end, linebacker, offensive line. I mean,
yeah, we're on the same page.
Colston Loveland, maybe if he slides here, may not be ready to play for a while, but I think that would be a good fit for him. A bigger cornerback would also be a good fit here. And maybe this is where that group of top tier cornerbacks that didn't really live up to expectations or had injuries in 2024 start to come off the board.
All right, let's go to the Baltimore Ravens here. Pick number 27. They bring back Ronnie Stanley on a 3-year contract. Cooper Rush, backup quarterback. DeAndre Hopkins to play wide receiver. Patrick Ricard back to play fullback. Ben Cleveland returned as well. I mean, I'm not going to break any news here. The Ravens have a good roster. I think they could use a dominant pass rusher. They have some guys out there. They rotated edge. I think they could use some help there. I think eventually you got to think about what happens after Marlon Humphrey slows down a little bit. He's still a good player, but he's getting older. And then I think you can still use some help at guard, Tony, and some help at wide receiver.
I'd also say safety as well. I agree with you on edge. I think safety is a position they could use some depth at the receiver position. How many times have they taken receiver in the first round? I mean, you see how important the left tackle position is because everybody thought, through the combine that Ronnie Stanley was going to get cut. And what do? They sign him to an extension. So I think it tells you that, number one, obviously the importance of the position. Number two, there are still concerns about the players available at the left tackle spot in this year's draft.
All right, let's go to the Detroit Lions, Tony. They do a lot of Small deals, bringing back a lot of their own guys. Derek Barnes being the biggest one. Marcus
Yep.
Davenport back. Le'Veon Zarique back. They also bring in DJ Reed, the cornerback rather from the Jets on a big 3-year contract. Boy, that Lions roster is good, man. It's funny. You get to the end of this draft order, and you're like, and I understand why these teams are so good. I think they could still use an edge to complement Aiden Hutchinson on the other side. I know he had a good year last year. Amik Robertson, I don't, there's just so much bad tape early in his career. I would think a nickelback is something I would still look at. And then I'd look at a little depth at wide receiver behind
Yeah.
Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamison Williams.
Defensive line, wide receiver, maybe another safety at this spot. It's kind of funny. You mentioned how they brought Barnes back on a big contract. Well, the word was that Aaron Glenn was going to try and sign Barnes in free agency. Not only the Detroit Lions signed Barnes, but they signed DJ Reed, who was the Jets' best cornerback last year. Played better than Ahmad Gardner, so that was a major coup for them.
All right, so let's go now to the Washington Commanders. And I think when you look at the roster, you see, all right, they were good last year, but they had some holes to fill, and I think they did a really good job filling some of those holes. I still don't quite understand why the Texans traded Laramie Tunsil, but now he's the blindside protector for the Commanders' young quarterback, which is just phenomenal for them. Deebo Samuel comes over in a trade from the 49ers. They bring back Bobby Wagner. They bring back Mariota. They bring back Zach Ertz. And then they sign Javon Kinlaw to a surprisingly massive deal, Tony, which that kind of took me by surprise a little bit. But they still have some holes here, man. I think they could use an edge player. I think they could use a safety, inside linebacker. How much longer is Bobby Wagner going to play? And then I think a tight end and maybe even a running back on offense.
Cornerback and running back as well. I think after the Bears, I think the Redskins came out of free agency as the second most improved team, if you will, with all their moves, especially Tunsil at left tackle. I agree with you at edge. I agree cornerback. I also think running back. Again, what do they do? Because of where they're drafting. Do they take an Omarion Hampton? Do they take the kid from UCLA to fill the edge need? They're going to have some options. Do they trade back? I mean, I'm sure there'll be some teams that want to trade up to maybe get a quarterback. If there's one on the board, they could trade back and get some extra selections. But I mean, the fact is the Redskins. I apologize. The Commanders are a better team now than they were on March 1st.
Yeah, they're just trying to build around Jaden Daniels and make another deep run into the playoffs. All right, let's go to the Buffalo Bills, Tony. They're a team that I think has, just trying to do what they can to figure out a way to beat the Chiefs, and they just can't seem to be able to do it. A lot of bringing back their own guys, which I think makes sense for them. They're a good team, right? Josh Allen, big extension. Greg Rousseau back. Khalil Shakir back. Terrell Bernard back. And then DeMar Hamlin back. Ty Johnson back at running back. They also bring in Josh Palmer on a nice little contract to help that wide receiver core. I would have liked him with a little bit more speed and pop, but Palmer's a good player. Michael Hoyt, the defensive tackle, a defensive lineman they bring in. PED suspension, same for Larry Ogunjobi, but those guys will help up front. Joey Bosa comes in. He kind of slots into that veteran Von Miller spot with him departing from the Bills. But I still think they could use a little help at depth at corner, Tony. I think they could still use another edge player to help. And then I do wonder if they start wondering about replacing James Cook. Not that James Cook is an issue or he's not great. He's really good. But he's talked about wanting a monster running back contract. And I'm not sure with the way the Bills are structured, they're going to be able to afford paying a running back a ton of money.
Well, we thought, 2-3 years ago, they were going to take the kid from Iowa State. They passed him up. They take Kare Elam. The Jets take the running back from Iowa State, Breece Hall. He turns out to be a star. And then Kare Elam has been a total bust for the Buffalo Bills. They just traded him to the Dallas Cowboys, as you mentioned early on. I think that was more of a scheme fit. So I think that obviously running back is consideration. I agree with you with depth at cornerback. I also think defensive tackle. I think they got to get a bigger guy in there, more of a run stuffer in there to help the players that are already on the roster.
All right, 2 more teams to go here. We got the Chiefs, Tony. Again, they're trying to figure out their left tackle spot. That's been something they've been trying to figure out for a couple of years here in terms of how they're going to protect Patrick Mahomes' blind side. And I think after what happened in the Super Bowl, they understand quite well how important that is.
Yeah.
So they bring in Jalen Moore, who's never really been a full-time starter, but they give him a pretty big contract to play tackle for them. They bring in Christian Fulton to play corner. Trey Smith back as a franchise tag guard. He already signed that. Nick Bolton, a 3-year deal. Hollywood Brown back for them as well. And I look at it, Tony, I think at some point you have to draft Travis Kelce's replacement at tight end. I think that's fascinating. Could an Elijah Arroyo type of guy, maybe not in round 1, but round 2, be someone they look at? I think they could use some pass rush help on the edge, and they could use corner and wide receiver help. And then, if there's an offensive tackle too, I think the Chiefs actually have a fair amount of needs given the fact that they were in the Super Bowl.
Yeah, and left tackle is the biggest need. I mean, is Jalen Moore going to be the guy that, kind of solves the issue? They took Sua Matea from BYU last year in the second round. Thought it was a great pick. Never panned out. Wayne Morris has never
By
really
the way,
panned
though,
out.
just real quick on Sua Matea, we knew that he wasn't ready to go right away. I think pulling the ripcord on him after just 1 year would be a mistake.
I agree. And he was taken in the second round. So it's not like it's a first round bust. You knew he had the upside. It's just that the mental aspect had to, and the fire had to meet the physical skills because he had the physical skills. Now, I believe they got him starting at guard after the trade of Thuney. So maybe you develop him at guard. Maybe he turns out to be a good guard that could eventually be a left tackle. Wayne Morris, the third round pick from 2023, has never really panned out. That's kind of been their Achilles heel, as you mentioned, as we saw during the Super Bowl. I would agree with you. At tight end, you got to get somebody in there in the future to replace Travis Kelce, who does not have that much tread left on the tire, and a receiver as well.
All right, finally, the Philadelphia Eagles, Tony, they're really good. But I was surprised when I took a look at their roster. I think this is going to be a big reinforce the trenches draft for the Eagles. They lose Milton Williams. They lose Josh Sweat. Lane Johnson gets a year older. They lose Mekhi Becton. I think this is a big offensive, defensive line draft for the Eagles as they try to re-solidify up front on both sides of the ball. And then I think inside linebacker and corner are two other spots where they might want to look at somebody too.
And Harry Roseman loves drafting offensive linemen and defensive linemen. I mean, he basically, the Eagle fans laughed at him when he selected Cam Jurgens in the second round of the 2022 draft. Look how that has panned out. I agree with you. Offensive line, how long is Lane Johnson going to be around for? There were rumors that he was going to retire after they won the Super Bowl. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. An edge rusher to replace Josh Sweat. I would agree with you. Offensive and defensive line. And that's Howie Roseman's strength.
I'm with you, Tom. Anything you want to add before we say goodbye?
No, I know this week, as we're speaking on Tuesday, the pro day workouts are really kicking into gear. There were a bunch yesterday with UCLA and Arkansas and Syracuse. The Big 12 workouts are happening this week. Shedeur Sanders, again, is not going to throw at the Big 12 workout. He's going to throw at the Colorado Pro Day. So I'm sure we'll have a bunch of news next week on the pro days.
Yeah, we'll have that, and we'll have a mock draft as well as Tony and I do our post free agency mock draft, which I think is always a little bit more educational. And really good job. We did not really mention any players connected with teams much today, so that'll leave a lot to chew off the bone for tomorrow's episode of Draft Season, brought to you by Moody's, a proud partner of the New York Football Giants, uniting the brightest minds that turn today's risks into tomorrow's opportunities. Learn more at Moody's.com. For Tony Pauline from Sportskeeda, I'm John Schmeelk. Tony, anything on Sportskeeda coming up people should know about?
A lot of pro day information. If you want to know how players have done at pro day and who they are meeting with or who they are talking to, I mean, we just had two articles go up before the Arkansas, the UCLA, and the Syracuse pro day. And we'll have an updated mock draft by the end of the week, a post-free agency mock draft.
Nice, and that's what and then me and Tony will do our own next week. So, of course, no one's more locked in than Tony on this stuff. Check him out at Sportskeeda. I'm John Schmeelk. And, of course, you can find Draft Season on your favorite podcast platform, the Giants app, or just go to Giants.com/podcast. You can find that and all of our other podcasts as well. For Tony Pauline, I'm John Schmeelk. We'll see you next time, everybody.